Hello and welcome to Builders, the podcast where we dive into the minds of those building creative and innovative tech products. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Joris van der Donk, a senior solutions architect at Amazon Web Services, who has a fascinating background and a genuine passion for software development. In today's episode, we'll cover Joris's thoughts on good development practices, his approach to learning, and the importance of setting goals, and enjoying the creative side of software development. So let's jump in. Joris, thanks so much for being here. A warm welcome to the podcast. How's it going?
Thank you so much it's really great to be here. So thank you for inviting me and having a lovely chat today with you.
No worries. Lovely to have you here. Let's talk a little bit about early beginnings in programming, right? I'm led to believe that you had a very, very early beginning, right? You started programming at the age of 6, I believe, and seriously coding by the age of 11. This is very, very early. What initially drew you to the world of programming?
I think so. I grew up in the early 90s in the Netherlands, and one of the things that we had access to in our family was a Commodore 64. So a pretty old computer from the early 80s. And what I remember I'm the youngest in my family of 6, so I have a brother who's 8 years older than I am. And he was always playing games on the Commodore 64 that we had and things like that. And from a very young age, I was kind of in that environment of just playing games and enjoying the beautiful technology and the things they can produce, which are dazzlingly great graphics at the time and beautiful music, which still is beautiful even today, right? The Commodore 64 SID chip, I love that thing to death. But the thing about this was that as I kind of realized that you would play a game and you would see like names of people on the screen, and like there's actually people that make these things, right? And my brother, who's 8 years older than I am, he already started like programming a little bit, using so he's like 8 years older than I am, and we had like these books in Dutch, which literally just had code, right? So they had games, beautiful cover art that really dazzled your brain, and like what what cool games are inside of this book, and it literally just contained source code listing. And what my brother would do is he would start programming things and creating some of these games, and I would just kind of look on and be like, hey, that's kind of cool, right? You can do cool things with this device. And a couple of years later, I think I must have been around 6 at that time. We got another computer, a 46 DX2 PC, fantastic device. And this was the family computer that everyone then moved on to. But then the Commodore 64 was still in the attic, just sitting there doing nothing. And I would have to ask for like permission for like my hour on the computer, but this Commodore 64 is in the attic, just sitting there.
Collecting
the problem is, if you ever boot one of these things up, right, it can play games, but unlike like an NES where you put in the cartridge, you boot it up and it just starts the game. Commodore 64, you boot it up, you get a blue screen, brilliant blue, some text on there, and a flashing blue square. And how do I have floppies with all these games, how do I load them? Well, actually, it turns out, if you want to load a game on the Commodore 64, you actually have to almost like write a basic program. Like you have to use a basic command to very imperatively tell the disk device to load the file list and do all kinds of things.
Right.
And so I wrote this on a piece of paper what I have to do to like load my games, and I could play games, etc. And then after a while, I got done with those games, so like I'm a bit bored, and I look at that book. There's a book right here. There's more games, but I have to type them myself. So let's just start doing that, right? Let's just start typing those games in and see what happens. And because they're written in BASIC and because they're written in Dutch, right, with Dutch instructions, I could kind of like gradually learn how things worked. And most of these games were a bit too for like older people than 6-year-olds me, because they're like management simulation games and like very like there's just a bunch of text on the screen and like no like fancy graphics and like the games that I was used to at that time. And so I remember this Lunar Lander game that was in there, and it was literally just numbers, and like you have to mathematically deduce what your next action is going to be. And I thought that's not how you make a game like this. You need to move the Lunar Lander onto the lunar landscape, and there needs to be graphics in there. And so I started, and that's kind of like where I started. And I think up until like around the age of like 9 or 10, that's kind of like the kind of games I would try to make. And I was really bad at it. I made so many errors. I literally hard coded every possible state in my computer program in like ASCII art, basically, right? Or PETSCII art, as it was called in the Commodore 64.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just this, and like I really didn't know what I was doing. But I kind of got that itch from that, right? I started learning, and like very slowly, I kind of like got into things. And then when I was 11 years old, I got for my birthday a CD containing software called the Games Factory. And the Games
Mm-hmm.
Factory is a piece of software where you can use that to make games. And it doesn't
Mm-hmm.
really use like a programming language necessarily. It's like an event-based programming system. So you
Right.
basically say, if you want to make like a Pong game, then you can basically say, hey, if the ball hits the paddle, then bounce it horizontally, that kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there was an internet community associated with this, and that's really where I got started, like really making things seriously. And it was a beautiful. I think like from the age from like between 11 and 13 or 14 years old, I don't think I've ever learned as much in a couple of years as I've
Mm.
ever done in my entire life when it comes to the art of creating software. Just working with other people and like seeing what they do and then riffing off of that was
Mm.
such a beautiful experience. I think in my very early life creating software. Yeah.
Really, really fun story, and interesting to hear how you had that kind of. I assume that kind of. Would you say your kind of oldest sibling here, 8 years older, was like an inspiration? Obviously, inspiring in the sense that they helped you get started or kind of opened that world up to you. Are they still that figure for you now today?
Not anymore, I would say, but I think in my early years, definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
And like especially when we had like the faster PC and everything. One of the things that also really helped actually was the lack of help in a weird way. I know it sounds really
Right.
really
Right.
silly, right? It's like opening up the door, but like, hey,
Mm,
listen, like I had to figure that out for myself how to load a game, right? And there
mm,
was
mm.
something on a piece of paper written out, and
Yeah.
like and I just have to use them and learn it, and there was no help
Yeah.
for me necessarily. And of course, if I really get stuck, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
what's really beautiful about that early environment, especially on the Commodore 64, was like you can't break it. Like it's impossible to break it necessarily. You could definitely do
Yeah.
it with a
Yeah.
46D with a PC, and I did that plenty of times as well, especially when I got one myself later on. But I think it was really that key thing of like opening up the door and kind of like showing that it's possible to create games with
Yeah.
really cool software, right?
Mm,
And
mm.
that you are the one that is doing that, and that you are the one that can make those creative decisions within that software. Because as a
Mhm.
gamer, even when I was young, I was always like, would it be great if it was like this instead? And now it
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
like, well, actually, I can maybe make it that way, right? So I can maybe make my own game to
Yeah.
make that happen.
Yeah. So you had that creative mindset even back then. Nice. And yeah, you touched upon what, six in your family and sharing one computer. It brings back memories of my childhood where we were four siblings, all trying to fight for access to the computer at
Hmm.
one given point in time. And then if one was on the computer, the other one would be on the landline chatting to friends or family, and it'd be obviously
Yes.
the internet would break. Yeah. So nice memories. But with such an early start in programs, you must have, I can imagine, a unique perspective on what constitutes kind of good development practices. Now, what are some? Let's talk about some practices you believe are
Hmm.
key to successful software development.
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of things, right? And also I have to kind of like put a bit of a disclaimer on here, right? These are just my own opinions, not the opinions
Yeah,
of
yeah.
any of the people I've ever worked for, any of the companies I
Mm,
currently work for and have worked for in the past. But I really think one of the key things, at least in my personal experience, has always been to have fun with it, right? Like you need to
mm,
have fun and also really care about the work that you do as a software engineer when you're creating software. And I don't mean necessarily like, caring about the product you're making, but I think you need to care about making software and making software good. And really,
mm,
really care about it. I'm really passionate about like, oh, I made something and it's I'm not too happy about this code, and then really like that should make you feel sad, right? That should make you feel
mm,
sad, and you want to
mm,
like improve that. And of course, that's difficult, right? When you work in a company, etc. But I think that's kind of like a key part of it. But I think
mm,
similarly, right, from the company perspective or like the team perspective, I think a company also needs to provide time for people to actually do things beyond the normal
mm,
scope. I do
mm.
feel that sometimes when I speak with friends or some places I was kind of like involved with, where they like some companies run their people at like 90% of their capacity or like maybe close to 100%, which means they
Right.
maximize the value that I get out of people, right? And then focus on the task to build a product. And I understand that, and I understand why people do that. That makes I completely understand the rationale there. But what I kind of think is that, and I was really fortunate. The first company I ever worked for, we had this thing where everyone ran at 70%, and then on like 80% maybe, right? And on Friday you can do whatever you want, right? Go ahead and do something, like just innovate, try something out, make something, fix that function you've really hated developing, and you're really like, I should have made this better, right? Friday, go ahead and have fun, fix it, right? And what I kind of learned from that, and what I'm starting doing, especially, like I just started creating things, and they were useless very often. But I would play around with new technology, right? Like AngularJS came out. I'm trying that out. React came out. I'm trying that out, right? I started developing with these technologies, and also I started, and I think this is definitely something I always recommend people do. I started creating something, and the first thing I would do is git init. Second thing, git commit, initial commit. Here we go. And now I started my project and trying to experiment with it. And what happened over time, as I worked there for several years, and what happened over time is, like, after like 5 or 6 years, I had this enormous library of things I've created, right? Experiments I've once done. And then, it's very often I end up stacking these almost, right? Like, oh yeah, I had this really great solution for this one problem, and now I'm trying to create something new that now uses React. Okay, cool. Well, I can reuse this and reuse that, etc. And so you create this kind of like your own personal tool sets, and that's been so useful for me as I went along. Yeah,
it's a really, really interesting approach from a company to kind of allow that time as well for that creativity. Absolutely, particularly if it's across a border, across a department. So you've obviously, as part of your your working environment, your professional career, but also side projects and whatnot, it sounds like you've worked on numerous projects for the sheer fun of it, right? Can you tell us a little bit about a few of these, some of your favorite side projects, and what motivated you to take them on?
I've had yeah, sure. I've had several. One of the most recent ones, I think, which I thought was which I'm very happy about, is actually like a mod for a game. So there's this game called Sulaco, and it's written in the old Doom engine. I love Doom. I have a very strong like for classic Doom. Sulaco uses a very modern version of this engine. And in this world of Sulaco, there are robot vacuum cleaners that roam around this game world, and they have a smiley face on them. There's like a little display on them. They have a smiley face on them. And like when they get close to you, the eyes turn into hearts. They jump up and down. They're happy to see you. Or you can pet them, which is fantastic. I love this. And then for some reason, I remembered this Tumblr post or like this image about people like putting knives on top of a Roomba or like on top of a vacuum cleaner. Like just putting a knife on it, right? And having it roam around. And like, it might stab you. And so it was middle of summer here in Sweden. I was walking outside and I just remember this. And I recently played this game called Sadako. And I was like a few kilometers away from my home. And I was like, I really need to add this into the game. I really need to make a mod for this game where I add the knife into the game, right? And it would be hilarious if then the robot vacuum cleaner comes up to you and like stabs you, and then you lose some health and things like that. And it was very stupid, and I was like very far away in the middle of summer again. Like summer in Sweden is beautiful; you really want to be outside.
Yeah.
But I just rushed home to make this happen. Right, I spent like 4 hours inside. When it's super hot outside, and even inside it's even warmer. And I spent time making this mod, and I really just wanted to make it because I thought it would be very funny. I want to show it to the developer, like, hey, look at this. This is very stupid, right? But very funny as well. And that was kind of my motivation. I just wanted to I wanted to create something that would make people laugh, right? Or at least like give them a bit of delight, right? As they interact with this thing. And so I made this thing and I put it up on GitHub and I added it to like the Steam Workshop, and you can download it and you can like use it. And it's very stupid and silly, but I really like those kind of things are really the kind of things I like the most, right? So when you write software, when you write something which is just a joke, and many people would say it's a stupid joke, it doesn't make any sense. Maybe many people would not laugh about it. But there's going to be a few people that find it to be very funny. And I think just knowing that there is someone out there who thinks that's hilarious is enough for me to start working on something.
That's super. So it sounds like you kind of you approach development of these kind of side creative projects as it's an approach of like both art and science, right? Obviously, the science side means
Yeah.
it works essentially, but the art's kind of,
Yes.
you know, having fun with this and getting creative. How do you go about setting personal goals and planning your approach when you start on new projects like these?
I think it's actually quite difficult, right? Um, like planning things and setting up personal goals is something that especially for personal projects, I kind of struggle with that. Or rather, I should
Mm-hmm.
say, I try not to do that too much because what I
Right.
find, right? Well, okay, I have one goal always, or two goals always. First of all, I'm not going to make any money from it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to make any money from any of my side projects.
Mm-hmm.
It has to do with the history of working together with other people and people developing things in the open, which I really respect. That was very pivotal to my early career, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
what got me to here today. And I want to be able
Yep.
to contribute back to that community. Second of all, related to that is doing things in the open source. So I kind of have like
Yep.
anti goals or like, hey, this is just how I develop things. It has to be open source. I have to be able to
Mm-hmm.
make no money from it because I have a job,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's why I do that.
Yep.
But like that balance, like the other thing I try to do when I do a side project, right, or when I learn like new technology, is kind of like because that's very often where things come from, right? I have like a stupid idea to do something cool, and then I
Mm-hmm.
find a tool which I've never used before. And what I kind of often end up going into is this kind of situation where, hey, I want to solve something, and get there, and here's maybe a tool that can help me do this.
Mm-hmm.
Let's make a project that allows me to verify that. Or let's make a very small project, scope it down to like one day, and let me just start working on this. And I think that's kind of a lot of my goals are kind of related to that kind of thing where I want to make sure that I can get something done. So I want to keep things small and self-contained,
Mm-hmm.
but I also want to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that I get pleasure out of it, right? I get some kind of
Yeah.
fun out of it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
usually, like often it kind of like the goal is often very similar to the motivation I talked about earlier, right? The goal is someone needs to laugh about it and say this is very funny,
Mm-hmm.
right? And like
Mm-hmm.
that always gets me like, okay, cool, that's fine, that's a great goal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
no one sees
Yeah.
it, if no one laughs, maybe in
At
five
least
or
you've
ten
had
years
fun
down the
doing it,
line,
right?
yeah, exactly. They just had fun doing it,
Yeah.
right? And I think that is
Yeah.
so key to what everything that I do in my spare time. Like I need to be enjoying
Mm.
it. I don't want to make money from
Yeah.
it. I don't want to. It has to be fun for me or engaging
Mm.
or learning experience.
Mm. And you said that you've been doing part of these as kind of testing out new tools or new languages, essentially.
Yep.
You mentioned AngularJS and React.js. So you're obviously passionate about programming languages in general, but in terms of kind of pushing the boundaries of programming languages, has there been any kind of anything surprising that's happened, or that you've kind of achieved by pushing a language's boundaries? How easy is it for you to kind of test out a new language and like just for a small period of time? Um,
Yeah, there's a couple of questions there, right? And the answer is of
yeah.
course like very very difficult, so depending on situation, right? But the way that kind of when it comes to like pushing the boundaries, I actually find it to be very difficult sometimes. And the reason why
Mm,
is because a lot of programming languages are actually like very good, like they're very well designed. Even my
mm.
favorite language, JavaScript, and I can hear the people with the pitchforks in the background as they're listening to this. Um, I love JavaScript. I'm sorry, I just love it. Like JavaScript
Yeah.
is a bad language. It is inherently a bad language, but if you use it correctly, it's a great and phenomenally fantastic
Mm,
language, right? And I kind of like some of the things that I've used JavaScript for like 15 years now, and one of the things I very strongly remember is it went through a very big evolution, right? Because the core of JavaScript is phenomenal, like the way that all of that works, the event-driven nature of it, everything is
mm,
asynchronous. That is actually beautiful. But initially, if you remember, like before promises, people use callbacks for everything, right? You make a web request, you add a callback to it, and so
mhm,
eventually you would
mhm,
end up into this callback hell kind of situation when you're writing JavaScript code. And so people were like, "Hey, this should be improved, right? This is kind of unfortunate." And I was in the same situation, right? And what I always liked about JavaScript, and what I kind of, and why I think if you have a programming language with a very good core set of functionality, there is no problems and you can do anything basically.
mhm,
Or the boundaries don't exist anymore. What happened in the JavaScript world is people said like, "Hey, wouldn't they kind of like designed this promises API, and rather than like releasing this as like the next, specking it out and then releasing it as the next feature in JavaScript or like ECMAScript standards, what I actually
yeah.
did is they just made it possible to they made a transpiler, which basically transpiles your source code. So it allows you to use promises even though they don't exist yet in language, and transpiles it into callbacks. And they're beautiful. And I think that is such an innovative thing about JavaScript and the way that works. Because people just create things. They're like, hey, here's a problem that I suffer from. Let's introduce this new concept. This could become a standard in the future, but rather than waiting until it happens, let's just make it so you can use it today, and then we can get feedback from people, and then we can use it to improve the language itself. And that's, I think, within JavaScript, I've really never hit like really concrete limitations where I end up not being able to do something, right? And that's also why I appreciate the language, right? You can always continue working on with JavaScript and things like that. With other languages, I've sometimes seen those, but those are typically like very core functionalities, like Python 2 had one of these things, so like asynchronous support was not really there. And you could use different libraries for this, but they weren't really integrated with the language in that way until Python 3. And then in those kind of cases, you kind of hit some limitations, and those are difficult to work with. But you're not the only person that's doing things, right? You're not the only person that's hitting these kind of things. And so, looking at the community and what they're doing gets you into that state where, hey, here's a solution for this. And as I mentioned earlier, like, hey, take a Friday, start a new project, try it out. Does it work for you? Great. Maybe you can use it. Doesn't it work for you? That's too bad. You can check it again next year to see if it solves your needs now. So
exactly, and you gave it a go.
Exactly.
But when it comes to trying these, new languages or frameworks, libraries, or even just tools, what's your approach? Do you have any kind of particular strategy for like diving into something new?
Yeah, I think it kind of boils down into, again, like what I mentioned a bit earlier about trying to keep things as small as possible, right? So I try to scope things as small as possible, and I also try to have a very concrete use case for why I'm learning something. I'm not really the kind of person who, like, I enjoy learning things, I really do, but I typically don't like the learning aspect of it. And I understand this is a bit weird, perhaps, right? But like, if I want to solve a problem and let's say it's written in Java, and let's suppose for a second I don't know Java. I do, but let's say for the sake of argument I don't, right? If I want to solve a problem in a piece of software I use and it's written in Java, I don't start by learning Java, right? I start by learning the things I need to solve the problem. And that's really all you need, right? And as soon as you get that, as soon as you know how to solve your problem, you're basically golden. And by that time, hopefully you'll have learned other things, right? And then you can kind of build on top of that. But I really try to avoid the learning for learning's sake and try to focus more on learning to solve a problem. And I think that's been really key in everything I do. Now, of course, there is, of course, a bit of a difficulty like learning something new, and I think many people struggle with this as well. And I think the way that I approach that is actually to reflect a lot, and also to again scope problems down to smaller problems, which I think is actually the core programmer skill, right? Programmers are fantastic at, here's a problem, I need to make an app that allows you to play music on your phone, right? And then dividing that problem into many, many different smaller problems, and then tackling the smaller problems individually. I think learning is the same thing, right? Like when you're like in a state where you're like, I don't know how to solve this, I don't know how to do this, or I don't know how to work with this. You can also just reflect on yourself and think for a moment, like, well, what's the knowledge I'm missing right now, right? Can I search in documentation for the solution to this? If not, can I set up an experiment, right? Create a new project, make a small test project, test it out. Doesn't that work? Okay, cool. You've learned something, right? You've experimentally learned something. And a lot that I really like doing, because I work sometimes with software that has documentation which is, let's say, not the greatest. But source code is right there. And so source code is the brilliant documentation. And you being able to experiment with software is just a fantastic way of learning something as well. So I kind of like to avoid documentation as much as possible. I know that sounds kind of crazy, but really I try to solve the problem first and then gradually find my way around to documentation. That's worked really well for me.
Super. And if you're if you were learning a new language today, maybe you are, but if you were, what would it be, or what will it be?
Oh, I'm currently learning like 3 different programming languages too. Seriously,
one's not enough, right?
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's like I've always, and this is kind of like also my history, right? It's like I started, of course, with like this very the games factory is a very visual system. It's not actual code. And I remember I was like 13 years old, and I thought like, I'm not a real programmer. I need to learn an actual programming language that's text based, right? And not basic. It needs to be something good. So I started off low level with C and Intel 60-bit assembly. That worked out really well. I was modding another game from an Italian program, and that was like a fantastic thing. But I've always had this appreciation for low level programming languages and system level programming languages. And then my career ended up being JavaScript, like the highest level language you can think of. So that was always, and like, I don't mind that, right? And getting into cloud stuff, like, I don't mind it. That's totally fine. I love JavaScript. I found my love there. That's totally fine. But I still have a deep fascination with like how a CPU works and low level stuff. And so but like C is a terrible programming language. And C++ is evolving in a way that I don't understand anymore. And so, I've looked into like Rust. Rust in particular is a language that I really want to learn. And I've made several projects in Rust. I find it to be a very difficult language to learn. It is incredibly difficult. But that's also something I'm working on. And then there's another language called Zig. And Zig is another very low level, kind of more towards the C level of things. And I'm learning that currently as well. And one of the things I'm doing with Zig in particular to learn it, which has been fantastic, and like if it's interest, like look into this. It's a beautiful project. It's a project called Ziglings, and it's based on
Ziglings.
Ziglings, yes. So like
Okay.
Zergling from StarCraft, but Zigling. And it's based off of a similar project called Rustlings for the Rust programming language. Okay. And what Ziglings is, it's a Git repository, you clone it, and then there's a program and it's broken, you need to fix it. And above the program is just, here's the background that you need to know to solve this problem. And then you run it, and then you compile, and the test is complete, and then you go to the next one. And it's a beautiful way of learning. I really appreciate it a lot. Because as I kind of mentioned, like I don't really like documentation is difficult, right? I want to take it into practice. I want to solve something. And once I've solved something, I want to try to apply it to my own problem. So I like, hey, hang on, I'm reading this thing over here. Does it also imply X, Y, or Z? I want to try it out immediately. And what Ziglings allows you to do, because there's a problem right there, there's code right there, you need to fix it, you need to fill in the missing blanks. You literally just like, hey, ... You need to, what do you write there? And you can play around until you know what the answer is. And when I'm reading from text, very often I find that I may think I know the answer, but how do I validate that I'm correct on this, right? And so by just compiling a program, run it, see if it works. Okay, cool, you made a mistake. Fantastic. The tests are there to help you out with this. And so that's really, hey, if anyone is making a programming language, and I'm not adhering to my own advice here, because I'm also making my own programming languages and stuff, and I'm not doing this, but if you're making a serious programming language, so unlike me, I'm making joke programming languages. If you make serious ones, please create something like this, or find someone in the community that can create this kind of like Ziglings style project, because it's been amazing. I really love this so much. I'm halfway through. It's very difficult. I'm now at pointers, and pointers are my weakness. So again, I like JavaScript. That's where I'm at. So like pointers are my evil nemesis. We'll get there sometimes. I'm gonna get there eventually. But yeah, that's been really fun. Yeah.
Nice. And your take on documentation, obviously, I think it's super interesting, given when you're working on specific problems and everything. But if you're learning a language or whatever it might be, generally, so you're starting from the start, and you're wanting to learn it kind of inside out. Are you kind of pro documentation then? Are you kind of very very much for documentation in general, or?
I am absolutely totally for documentation, right? I think it is probably one of the most important things you could do, right? When you're creating any technical product or library or things like that, is very important, because ultimately someone's going to hit into an issue, and then you'll probably want to direct into the documentation, not your source code, right? Because your source code is massively more complex. So I think documentation is actually like what is very important. I just find it to be more useful for me in kind of like the later stages of learning, not the early stages necessarily, unless there is documentation which is really like adapted to that. And part of the problem here, and I have to recognize this again, this is my personal situation. Like, I have played around with so many programming languages, right? And that context is, I think, part of an aspect of the learning path as you go through things, right? A JavaScript programmer has a different context. and so they're going to approach Rust from a different perspective. All of the like tooling perspective, they're like, oh yeah, great, we have that too, but like many of the concepts in Rust are completely alien to you, and so the learning path for a JavaScript developer into Rust is completely different from like a C developer into
Mm.
Rust, right? So like a C++
Mm.
developer
Mm.
into Rust. And I
Yep.
find that
Yep.
a lot of the like documentation or tutorials or things like that don't take it into consideration. And so they end up, here's irrelevant stuff. Okay, here's something you don't know anything about. And then you have to kind of like pause and understand that. And that's a journey that I struggle with, right?
Mm. Mm.
But in some ways, sometimes I'm just faster than documentation. Sometimes I'm slower. That's totally fine. But I
Mm.
do like the other side of this, right? Like when I get into trouble or when I get into a situation where I have no idea what I'm doing, I'm stuck now. Um, I rely on documentation. If there's no documentation, I'll read
Mm.
the source code. That's fine. But like having good documentation is the first thing I do, right? And it's the same
Yeah.
thing when
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
help other people, even with our, the stuff that we make at AWS. I always go through documentation. I always link to documentation as well. Like here's how you solve the problem, and here's the documentation the reference for this, so you can
Hmm.
also like read up on this in your own time, etc. I think that's super
Yep.
useful. Yeah.
Good. And a little bit about your role as your senior solutions architect, right? So I mean, just a little bit on kind of what that entails.
Hmm.
What does this involve? Essentially, I mean, yeah, my understanding is obviously you're responsible, kind of this overall technical vision for like a specific solution to, specific business needs, right? Is that a fair reflection of the role, or what does it involve?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. The way I like to describe it is that I'm part of basically sales departments, and
Hmm.
my role is to perform technical validation. So if a customer has a problem, and if we have a solution for this, then I'm there to make sure that that solution actually works for that customer and to fine tune it to their needs, etc. And that's a big part
Hmm.
of it. Another part of it is also thinking along with customers, right? It's like, oh, hey, we're going to be doing this or that, such as so, and then I ask questions about like, hey, what would you recommend that we do? And I can draw
Hmm.
up a diagram together with them in a conversation, or maybe it's just
Hmm.
reviewing the existing architecture. Like, hey, what have you done right now? Let's review it to
Gotcha.
figure out if there's any improvements that we can make. A lot of
Hmm.
this is, yeah, and it's kind of like in many ways, and this is the thing I really enjoy about what I do. It's also very often where I'm kind of like the bridge between customers and problems that I have, and
Hmm.
our solutions and our services.
Mm.
Sorry. And sometimes our services don't meet a need. So like, hey, cool. If only a service did this thing, then we could do this really great solution. And then I get to go
Right.
into the
Right. Right.
service teams and say, hey, listen, can we make this happen? Would this make sense?
My
And then you can
creative
improve
brain is
things.
starting to.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Because you can
Yeah.
always find these kind of like cool solutions sometimes,
Mm.
and like maybe that is a good use case for a piece of software, right? Like what
Yeah.
we find, and what I also find, is that when you're creating a product, and it could be a end user product, or it could be a product for technical people, for programmers. When you start that product journey, you don't really have an idea yet on how people are going to be using it, right? Or what they want out of it.
Right.
You have no clue typically. And then, especially for technical projects, where it's like, hey, I made this cool library for something, or like, hey,
Mm.
here's a great way to run containers in the cloud. The people actually want to use that, they're going to have so many more ideas that you could have even thought of, right? And
Mm.
it's so important
Mm.
to have to have people that are there to listen to people, so you can then give that feedback back to people that are developing a product,
Yep.
so you can improve it, right? So you can also make
Mm-hmm.
people happy. What I mentioned earlier
Mm.
about when I make software in my spare time, I want to make people happy. I want to delight them in a way. The way that I approach this is weird joke software, or funny things, or
Mm.
just things that may be useful, or games, etc. But I think a similar thing kind of applies to professional software development for other software
Yeah.
companies, right? Like we want to make things that delight people, right? We want to make things that are
Yep.
useful.
Yep.
And that's really a key aspect, I think. Or at least that's how I look at my role.
Mm.
Some colleagues of mine will probably have wildly different opinions of this. And I think that's fine, right? We are all unique individuals with unique backgrounds.
Yeah.
And one of the things I really appreciate about where I work right now is that that's very much so appreciated, right? Like I have a
Yep.
gaming
Yep.
background, and I'm appreciated for my gaming background, because that
Yep.
allows me to, help those customers out a lot, right?
Mm. No, I think it's a healthy. Yeah, very healthy approach to take. But it sounds like obviously in your role that there's a need to kind of balance business and technical needs, right? So how do you approach aligning these kind of technical infrastructure decisions with the kind of strategic goals of a customer? Is that a hard balance to make, or
I think it's not, because ultimately, like, customers have needs, right, and they
yep,
have things that they want to achieve, and we work backwards from that. That's
right,
basically
right.
it,
So
right?
you just take that problem and find the kind of optimal solution, as
Yeah,
optimal as it
yeah,
can be, right?
yeah, and
Yeah,
that works for
yeah.
them, right? And like, we can
Mm,
have conversations about that, and sometimes, I might propose, or I might say like, hey, I think containers would be great for this, and I have no idea what containers are, right?
right.
Well, we can do a training on this, and then if they're like, yeah, it's not for us, I can respect that,
Mm,
right? Like,
mm,
I
mm,
think if you've done software engineering or like solutions architecture, if you built anything, right, and you have a technical audience and you have technical people,
mm,
there's like, I think especially passionate people that can talk about the best way of doing things for hours. And I
mhm,
think most people will eventually realize, like, yeah, there's like 5 different ways, which are all very good. But
mm,
it's depending on your skill sets, depending on so many different factors, which one you end up picking, right? And I think,
yep.
you know, I as part of what I do professionally, and also like when I was a consultant, right, or when I was a software engineer, I would be prescriptive in what I think is a good approach for doing things,
Mhm,
and I would have the
mhm,
argumentation for like, here's the reason why, right? Here's the reason
yep.
why I think it applies to this particular problem, to your business, to your company, to the people that you have,
Yep.
etc., etc. But
Yep.
sometimes I miss the mark there, or I say like, well, actually, hey, listen, you're saying that this would be great because we are all in this programming language, but actually, we also use this one. Oh, great! Actually, you know what? That
Mm,
changes things, and that
mm,
conversation I think
mm,
is very important there as well, right? And being open
yep.
with why you're doing things. I think it's very vital, actually,
Mm,
in software development and solutions architecture and infrastructure provisioning, etc.
mhm,
Yeah.
mhm, mhm. And what are some of the most common challenges that you encounter, and how do you go about addressing them?
Oh, there really aren't any common challenges, I would say. I know that sounds kind of
They're all
strange.
unique, huh? Okay.
They are definitely
Yeah.
all unique in their own
Yeah.
ways. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think a lot of companies. So I work a lot within games, and I think one of the things that I tend to see, like, games and companies, they produce so much data, right? And finding a way to use that data in a way that makes sense for a business, in a way that's technically
Mm,
feasible and secure, etc., that is quite often just something that people struggle with, right? And it
mm,
could be like multiple different departments that all have a unique background as well. And in games, I think it's really, really difficult, because games, you will have, like, if you have a medium large sized gaming company, you're gonna have people that have incredibly diverse skill sets, incredibly specialized,
mhm,
right? Graphics
mhm,
engineer, they write shaders, they write ways of loading data into the GPU. That is a
mhm,
very wild, a very difficult thing. But you also have gameplay programmers that write maybe in Lua something, and you have people that write the game engine in C++, and then you have game designers that are trying to delight people that are playing games, and then you have marketing and have a different view on things and different things they want to achieve. And finding, and like, because there are so many different people that do things, and they all generate data in some way that could be useful, that as a business you can make decisions on. Getting all of that into a way where you can query it in a nice way can actually be quite challenging, because you'll need either
mhm.
someone that has all these skill sets and can get it done.
Yeah.
There's not many people like that on the planet, right? That really know every
Mhm.
single thing, and they can kind of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
step into that, like, hey, cool, you're a graphics engineer, and here's how all of that works. I know what you're trying to do. I know what your goals are. I know how data can help you achieve those goals. Um, they can do that, but also like work with marketing, right? So work with
Mhm.
different departments like finance, right? Like, what's important to the finance department is completely different again. And I think like
Yep.
getting all of that into like one cohesive structure and architecture, and doing it securely, doing it at scale, doing it in a
Mhm.
cost-effective way, doing it in a way that's reproducible. You gotta make another game, right? You gotta, like, games businesses are very often driven on the entire idea of like, we're gonna make a game this year, 2 years down the line, we're going
Yeah.
to make a new game. We're going to sell that one as well. So you want to make those solutions that you create reusable, right? So you want to at least, like, hey,
Yeah.
you've just built something. You don't want to reinvent the wheel next time. Doing that as
Mhm.
well
Mhm.
is actually very, very difficult. And so getting that done is usually like you have to align multiple different departments and different teams, and they all have priorities, and they all need to hit their targets. You have a marketing, you have a
Yep.
marketing plan and a launch date planned out. You have so many things that depend on
Yep.
this. Untangling that with your producers, another big problem there. I think that is just getting all of that done and getting it and like doing everything well and doing everything to the way that eventually will delight players of games. It's actually that is quite a difficult challenge, I would say. Yeah. But of course, there are solutions for that, right? Like there's there are so many different solutions to these kind of problems, and that's finding those and aligning things and aligning people and making sure the knowledge is there. That's also a big part of my job, right?
Very well put. I'm keen as well to kind of get your view on any observations that you may have had or are having in terms of like trends in software development. You've likely seen, I mean, loads, and how kind of best practices have evolved as
Yes.
well. Like, what are some trends in development today that you find particularly promising and exciting? And on the other hand, any that worry you as well. So, what excites you?
Ooh.
What worries you?
Well, okay, there's some obvious things about excitement and like things that I think are very promising, right? I mean, generative AI. I'm not going to talk about it. I think
I was
everyone
going to
like
mention it, but I
that's
didn't.
the
Yeah.
I mean that's the obvious answer in the room,
Yeah.
right? But I think it would be a very lame answer, and I want to give you an interesting answer. Even though I fully recognize like that's a very big thing, right? Generative AI
Yeah,
is
absolutely.
massive
Yep.
for everyone that's doing anything with software and products. So I think it's kind of like two things that I'm very excited about. One of them, again, it's a bit of a nerdy thing. I'm very sorry. But it's this thing called nominal typing. So nominal typing in APIs and in schemas. And so I'll explain what this is, right? So you're probably familiar with structural typing, which is, you have a user a record or user table in your database, and users have names, which is a string, and it has a email address, which is a string, and a password, which is something, etc., etc. And that's structural typing, right? You have fields, and those have a data type associated with them. The problem with that, especially like when it comes to APIs, is that, and also when it comes to users, is that like that's kind of meaningless, right? Like if I'm creating a web scraper, or like if creating something that can take a screenshot of a website, and I want to make this a product, I cannot, and let's say in my own, or like I'm using some kind of API, and I get like the URL as the address field, which is a string. If I have my own customer database, and I also have an address in there, which is like the street name, it would make no sense. Even though the field names are the same, they're both address. In one case, it's a street address, in the other, it's a address location on the internet. It would make absolutely no sense, even though they both have the same field name and the same data type, being string. It would make no sense to feed in the address for the street address into the function that I use to do the actual like screenshotting of a website. It makes no sense.
Right. No.
But your auto completion may suggest it, right? Like, and I think that is like that's kind of a problem there of like there's ways in which you can use particular fields and particular data and particular structures. And what nominal typing does is it just says it kind of like gives a semantic meaning to those. It doesn't really, right? But that's kind of like how I like to approach it. It gives some semantic meaning to this. And so with nominal typing, you can say explicitly, is this compatible or not? And what I find really interesting is when you then go into like conversions of things, right? So here is another example. Let's say you have a distance field, a distance field between two different locations on the planet, right? Well, you could. That's an integer, but like, what's the unit? Is it in meters and nanometers and centimeters? Is it miles, right? Or actually, probably it's a float, right? But like, what is it? What unit is that in? And when you have nominal typing, you can say, well, hey, listen, meters is a distance, and it's compatible with miles as a distance. So you can convert between it too.
Right.
I think encoding those kind of things in APIs and in databases and in data structures allows you to do more with that stuff without potentially running into issues, and also in a way that you can potentially automate as well. So I think nominal typing, it's like and especially within like schemas, etc. I think that's quite exciting because it just kind of enables more things as well in the future. It is again a very nerdy topic, very very in depth, I
No, but
guess.
I think it's super
Um,
interesting, and this is on the up, is it? Kind of how new is this? I must admit, it's the first I'm hearing of it. Yeah.
So as a like, I think it's like one of those computer sciencey kind of things where like people in the 70s wrote papers about it and we just forgot about it.
Mm.
That's at
Mm.
least how I kind of look at it. But I've seen like database engines and like projects and products that like start to work in this kind of behavior, where
Mm.
you kind of define things a little more along that line. Similarly, right? Like I think GraphQL is a good example of this, where GraphQL has, I think it's called filters or
Mm.
transformations, where you can
Mm.
actually say like that example I just gave about distance. Like you can actually in your API, when you invoke the API, you can say, "Hey, listen." Of course, if a program has added support for this in your backend, but you can say things like, "Hey, I want this distance in meters. I want to convert it into this or that, such as so."
Mm.
So
Mm.
you can
Mm.
see parts of this in different kinds of software, but I
Yeah.
think this is kind of new in the sense that I don't think a lot of people really realize how useful this could be, and even I don't really fully realize that yet. I just have this kind of like dreams of like
Mm.
automatically chaining software together, right? And like,
Mm.
hey, this is what I have. I like a schema registry of all the things I have. This is what I want, and then software go ahead and
Mm.
figure it out for me. Figure out a path in which I can change software together to get me that result, right? I have a
Yep.
URL
Yep.
to a video. I want a screenshot of that video, right? There should be a
Yep. Yep.
path. If you've modeled everything correctly, there should be an automatable path to create that and make that happen. I think that's
Mm.
gonna really, when we look into the future and like how people are going to be using software and how people are going to be creating software, I really think that's kind of like where a lot of things are going towards, where it's
Yep.
giving power to people that aren't engineers, that don't know a
Mm.
programming language, but still
Yep.
have programmable problems that I can automate
Yep.
and reuse,
Yep.
or
Yep.
change depending on the thing, right? Like why like if you have a solution which creates a screenshot from a YouTube video, why should that require an engineer if you start using Vimeo, right, or a different
Yep.
hosting
Yep.
platform for your videos?
Mm.
That is,
Mm.
I think a lot of companies kind of struggle with that because they have many problems where, oh well, need to get an engineer involved, and
Mm.
engineers are
Mm.
a difficult resource
Mm.
to get sometimes for to solve these things. So
Yep. Yep.
I'm excited for the automation aspect there. I think, and like
Mm.
just giving more accuracy into things because it is so silly that just everything is a string or like everything is a JSON object. Here we go. Like, okay, that's not useful. There's so many problems that are created by this, right? And no documentation, et cetera, et cetera. And so, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
just getting
Yeah.
more programmatic validation into places, which really just allow things to just go much smoother. And that's
Mm.
something, when I kind of look at, and we kind of see something similar in just like APIs, right? It's like, well, people just used to write REST APIs and just be like, here's an API, here's some documentation for it. Like
Yep.
nowadays, I think for the past 10 years probably, we write those things in schemas, right? An open API specification, and then you can generate a
Mm.
client library for those, and that will make sure that things are correctly in the way that they should be. Now, these don't, again, structural typing, so it doesn't allow you to make the mistake. So it still allows you to make the mistake of like, oops, adding a street address into this API
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
expects a URL. But we can get there, right? I think like adding more typing information about this kind of thing allows us to get there. But that is very difficult still, right? Because programming language needs to provide support for this. How would that work, etc. There are some
Mm.
projects which are looking at these kind of things, and I've read some documents and things like that, and like some old 70s things. Um, but it's still definitely a like, this would be cool in 20 years down the line. I wonder what that's going to look like in 20 years down the line. I think there is definitely something there,
Yeah.
but I,
Yeah.
I don't know yet what that's going to be, right? And that's the beauty of software and creating and designing
Exactly.
things.
Do you struggle to look too far into the future? What's your kind of what's your
Uh,
limit?
struggle, I mean, yes and no. I also really
Mm.
like science fiction, and one of
Mm.
my science fiction books especially, right? And there are so many science fiction books which have like an inherent software engineering thing behind them. So
Mm.
A Fire Up on the Deep by Vernor Vinge in particular has a lot of that. That series has a lot of it. And from that I find it's very easy to look into the future because it's been done for me already in different ways, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I think the challenge there is always like it's very easy to think like, oh, this could be possible. It's always very difficult. Like, is that actually like Like it's very easy to think like, yeah, we're gonna travel faster than the speed of light, and then we can make all these cool solutions happen. But like, hey, is it possible to do that? Right? We don't know if that's possible to travel faster than the speed of light.
Yeah.
Probably
Yeah.
not. And I think that's the kind of limitation there, right? Like, is this
Mm.
possible? It doesn't make business sense. But yeah, I'm
Mm.
always like I think it's very easy to kind of like hypothesize this perfect world in your head where every problem is
Yeah.
going to
Yeah.
be solved in this beautiful way where everything's interconnected and just everything just works. No one needs
Mm.
to read documentation or get stuck anymore, right? It's easy to think of that situation. It's very
Yeah. Yeah.
difficult to think of like how that's going to be achieved. I think that's the
Yeah.
challenge there.
Yeah. Yeah. But you got a dream. And I wanted to get your take on essential skills for
Mm,
developers. You mentioned the skill of being able to kind of take one problem and break it down into
yep.
smaller problems, which is, I think, a
Yeah.
fantastic approach and method and a skill, really. But what other skill or skills would you say are absolutely essential for developers to have, in your opinion?
I would say, and this is coming from a JavaScript background, so again,
Mm.
that's the context there. I would say using a debugger, and I know people are going to laugh about this, like, one of the key things is using a thing used to solve problems when you've made a mistake. That's a very JavaScript thing. I know, hey, listen, I like jokes, as you might have mentioned. This is a joke as well. But here's the thing, right? Debuggers are phenomenally useful. And I've worked with so many people that have never used one of those. And the way that I
Okay.
use them myself, and maybe this, like, I know there are other people as well that do this, but I want to evangelize this a little bit. Using a debugger before you write software is such a fantastic thing, especially in a dynamic programming language like JavaScript, actually. So what I tend to do, right, if I use like some software that one of my teammates wrote, or like some other internal team, or maybe even a third party, like what I sometimes do instead of like going into documentation immediately, right, which might be completely missing things or being incorrect and incomplete or whatever. One of the things I do is I just start like I import a library in my source code, and then I want to do something with it, and I don't know yet what I need to write, right? Because I don't know how this library
Mm.
works. So I just add a
Mm.
breakpoint in there, and then I run the code up until that point, and then I'm in this debugging environment. And from there, I can iteratively work on code. I can just experiment with it. I can see, right, what
Mhm.
is actually there in the actual virtual machine, right? What is there in the actual
Yeah.
runtime?
Yeah.
What do I have access to? Oh, does this function? Oh, cool. Let me just try it out, see what it does. And
Mhm.
of course, you
Mhm.
need to be
Mhm.
cautious with this if you're using third party and software that you haven't validated for security
Yeah. Yeah.
yet. But I think this is really like a debugger. I use it all the time when I especially for things I've written like 5, 6, 7 years ago, and I want to add something to it.
Yeah.
I am bad at writing documentation for my own things that I do in my spare time. That's not really something you're focusing on. So I just
Yeah.
like, cool. Import this thing, add a breakpoint in there, see what happens, right?
Yeah.
And then this is also super useful for like when you made a mistake or when you're like, hey, I'm not really sure what I need to do next. Debuggers are so
Mm.
powerful. I
Mm.
think it's a bit sad that I called it debugger, which kind of implies, yeah, you use it to remove bugs, but like, no, you use it to
Yeah.
write
Exactly.
software, to create software.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
first step,
Yeah.
that iterative development, right?
Mm.
And this has caused some, and I'm not going to say problems for me in the past, but I've definitely worked at places where they didn't have this. And then the first thing I would
Mhm.
do, right, I get a task, and then someone's like, hey, Joris, you have this task to do, should be done by the end of the week. And the next day they ask me, like, hey, how's it going? I'm like, yeah, I had this debugging functionality so I could debug this code. And they're like,
Mm.
why are you focusing on this? Why are you doing this? I asked you to write this, right, to solve this problem. And I'm like, well, listen, hopefully I'll be here for several years. I already want to get started to making sure I can work as fast as I can. And this is the way that I work as fast as I can, by
Mm.
making sure this is
Mm.
there. And this is the way that I like to work. Again, many other people find this to be difficult, or maybe they don't have that experience, or maybe they don't like it. But
Mm.
definitely, I would say using a debugger as part of our development lifecycle, I think is one of the skills that I would truly recommend people do. And kind of aligns
Mm.
is also profiling as well. Like if you're working on software which has some kind of performance requirements, use a profiler, right?
Yep.
Verify as you're writing something like, hey, did I write something that's super slow? Yes. Okay. Well, in that case, hey, you need to redesign what you've written.
Mhm.
I think
Mhm.
these are two things that many people kind of forget about, and so I would like to highlight their value, especially. Yeah.
Mm. Really well put. And a final question from me before I wrap up. Managing time. sounds like you've obviously got your professional work going on, but you're doing a lot on the side as well. How do you manage your time? Are you
Demos,
coding
yeah.
day and night?
I mean, that's what it boils down to sometimes, right? Like I went to bed at 2:30 tonight, so last night, so it's very late. I'm bad at this. I'll have to be very honest with you. I'm very bad with this. I think,
Yeah.
but like the way that I look at it, like the key thing that I always kind of keep in mind is like you have a life, right? Hopefully you have a life, and you have responsibilities, and for your work, to your family, to your kids if you have any, to your friends, etc., etc. And it is up to you to decide to what extent you need to, like, how to deal with that, right? And how to prioritize that. And ultimately, that's what it boils down to, right? There's never, I don't have enough time. It's rather, I'm not prioritizing this. And so I think it's valuable for everyone to reflect to themselves, like, do I find this to be valuable? Do I find this other thing to be valuable? And how do I stack those towards each other and make sure you're still doing, working on the things that you're responsible for and making sure that comes first and prioritizing that accordingly. Still, it's very difficult to manage time, and I find it extraordinarily difficult when I'm very excited about something because I'm like, I don't want to go to bed. I want to solve this problem. Or like, I'm making something very cool. Why would I go to bed at like already 1 o'clock in the morning? Oh well, because I have a meeting at 7 or 8. Maybe I should go to bed now, right? Because that's important. And I think that's the and like just being real and just kind of like having things in order in that way. I think it's just kind of like the way that I approach it. But still, I am bad at this. I can give people so many good advice. Following it is excruciatingly difficult. I wish
Exactly.
like, honestly, the one thing I just wish is like if we could just create more time, that would be fantastic. If we could just create additional hours into the day, like I would love that. Like if someone has a business that does that, contact me and I'll be a customer for sure. Yeah.
See what we can do. Maybe increase daylight hours, but I was going to say that's very, very hard in Sweden, particularly right now. No, super. Good tips, and I think good honesty as well, of course. Anything you'd like to add, Joris, before I wrap up?
No, JavaScript is a great programming language. I'm sorry, like I have to. I think
fighting for
I
it.
think
You're fighting its corner.
Like don't DM me. Don't DM me your bad takes on JavaScript. No, I mean I think it's like I think maybe the one thing I want to add is in the end, like, hey, listen, we're all working on software, right? And software is like it's a job for many, but I think there's so much fun you can have with it. There's so many jokes you can make about JavaScript. That's why I love JavaScript. Again, there's so many good JavaScript is a bad language jokes, and like having fun with that and finding the fun, finding the passion. Like especially maybe if you're working in a place where you're maybe not in the right position, or you're kind of stuck with things, or there's more things or maybe you're working on less than exciting projects, right? Like find a way in which you can make things fun. There is so much fun to be had writing software and writing products and working with others on things. And if you find it fun, if you find the fun in the things that you do, I think everything is going to be a million times easier. And then you'll have maybe not a million times more success, but let's say at least 2 times as much success, I think. And that's been very useful for me. And also, hey, it just makes my life better, just making stupid jokes about things, about software. Like I just like it. So that's my
not
final
taking
say,
things
I
too
think.
seriously.
Yeah, exactly, right. At least when you can, right? Of course, there's going to be cases where you have to be serious, but if you don't have to, then I think it's a great way also to make a community, to build friendships with your colleagues. And to raise the bar on things, right? So, like a lot of that comes from passion and seeing how fun things can be, especially towards like people that are just getting started in the industry. Hey, show them how fun it really can be, right? And the depth to which you can do stuff with it.
Nice. Really good points, Joris. And it's been a real pleasure to have you on the podcast, to hear your thoughts on development, on learning, on building things for the sake of building. I could basically feel your passion here, sitting here.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And for our listeners, if you're interested in following Joris's work, we'll have links for you in the show notes. Thanks once again, Joris, and thank you to all our listeners for tuning in to another episode of Builders. We look forward to the next one. Bye for now.